I'll just start it now. I think there are about 60 people already waiting in the room. Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll just give a minute or two for participants to roll in, and feel free to use the chat function on the bottom of your screen to just tell us where you're joining from and yeah, what city your name and what city you're joining from. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining us, thank you, and feel free to put your name in your location, your city that you're joining from in the chat box. We'll just give one more minute as more folks roll in before we get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Lots of international attendance, which is always great. Thank you again for joining. I can get us started now that we have a good amount of folks in the session. Welcome. Yeah, I'll just start with some technical reminders, but my name is Alphonse Tam from the Global Communications team at ITDP based in New York City. Um, yeah, and we're so glad to have all of you joining us this morning or afternoon or evening from wherever you are. And we are going to have a great session focused on a few of ITDP's data tools and resources, specifically our scope models and our scope tools for assessing BRT, bike lane networks, and off-street parking policies. And we'll be joined by a great group of team members from our international offices, as well as a representative from Guadalajara, Mexico. And I'll just quickly go through who will be speaking today. So we have Madeline Lieberman, who's our monitoring and evaluations associate, based in Washington, D.C., from the ITDP global team, who has been kind of spearheading a lot of this work on our scope tools. And then also Victor Medell, who's the lead for public transit and electrification on our ITDP Mexico team, who will be highlighting kind of the use cases that they've seen with the BRT tool, alongside Daniel Rodriguez, who works for our IME Plan, an agency in Guadalajara, Mexico, and who will be discussing kind of their applications of the BRT planning scope tool. And then finally, we'll have Carlos Nemesis, who's an urban planning associate with our ITDP Indonesia team, who will be talking a little bit more about scope and kind of like applications of the data tool more for bike lanes and parking. So you can get more of a well-rounded idea of yeah, all different applications. So just a few technical reminders. The session will last about 60 minutes or an hour, and we will also have live interpretations. Give me 1 second to share my screen. Sorry. Uh, yes. So the session will be about 60 minutes. It will also be recorded. Uh, we have non-English interpretations in Spanish and Bahasa Indonesia. So to access those, you can toggle at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar and enter kind of like the interpretation booth that you will be using. And we do have the chat box available for comments. But also feel free to enter any questions into our Q&A function, which we'll be monitoring for the discussion later. So I think with that, I'll pass it on to Madeline, who will be giving more context and background on our work with data tools.
All right. Thank you so much, Alphonse. So, as Alphonse said, my name is Madeline Lieberman, and I am the Associate for Monitoring and Evaluations in ITDP's global team. So, I'll be talking a little bit about the existing data tools that we have and a little spotlight on ITDP's scope tools. So, let's dive right in. So ITDP has many different online tools that can help to provide important data and ways to improve transport planning. So just to mention a few of these, which are all available through our website, there's the Atlas of Sustainable City Transportation, which has data on over 1,000 urban areas around the world. We also have our learning hubs, including the Bus Rapid Transit Resource Hub, which was recently launched. And these are sort of self-paced, classroom style modules where you can learn more about actually implementing sustainable transportation solutions. And then finally, we have our scope tools, which are available in Excel, which you can see screenshotted here. And you can find that in the publication section of our website, or you can find our new web tool platform at scope.itdp.org. But what are the scope tools? So scope stands for the simple calculators of project effects. And these are a suite of free tools that can estimate potential impact of sustainable transport infrastructure. So they can be used both at a kind of sketch level at the early phases of planning, or they can be used for evaluation after a project is put into place. And the suite of tools that we currently have includes Bus Rapid Transit, and I'll mostly be focusing on that for my presentation because we have the new web tool available for Bus Rapid Transit, but some of our speakers will also be talking about the tools for protected bicycle lane networks and for off-street parking policies. And all of these tools have in common, they predict impacts on air pollutant emissions and on climate pollutants. So what is the BRT scope tool? So this tool can estimate potential impacts of BRT corridor implementation. So it's a corridor level tool. And some of the key inputs for this tool, they include basic information about the city. They include characteristics of the future bus rapid transit fleet, as well as population or ridership data around the corridor. Additionally, there's the option to enter custom factors about your city or about the specifics of the bus rapid transit system. And the results, in addition to impacts on pollutants that I already mentioned, you can also see some intermediate outputs like changes in ridership that could result from the new BRT, as well as the percentage of those riders who may be shifting from other modes. And finally, the Excel tool can actually be used to roughly estimate LRT impacts as well, because it is so customizable. So that is one additional benefit, being able to estimate, multiple kinds of transport systems, although it's mainly most of the data is for BRT. So really the purpose of these tools is to create better transport planning and to create better systems. So the goal of the scope tools is to simplify the initial assessments that are used to support projects and to reduce the time and cost that go into these kinds of initial assessments often where a consultant might be hired to do a very complicated analysis. We're trying to create this free tool that anyone can use more easily to simplify that early phase. And so the BRT scope tool can help with corridor selection by providing different impacts for various different corridors. It also analyzes potentially the impacts of electrification, of a fleet technology change, and it also provides some really key quantitative information that can make a strong case for BRT, as well as for, and the same goes for the other modules of these tools. So some of the target audiences that you might be making this case to, and maybe some of our target audiences are represented in the room right now. So this information can be really useful for multilateral development banks that are providing climate financing. It can be helpful for climate ministries or government agencies that may be monitoring NDCs. And it can also be helpful for transport planning staff and advocates. So I want to talk a little bit about comparing the uses of the Excel tools as well as the new web tool. So these Excel tools are fully customizable. You can view all the backend data and calculations. However, they may be harder for less technical users to use, especially people who may be less familiar with Excel, and they don't have geospatial features. On the other hand, our web tools are simple to use with any level of expertise. They include geospatial features, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. They also have the ability to include large data sets, so we have some city level data included. And it's easier to save and compare the scenarios through the web tool by making an account. However, it is a bit less customizable. We've included the most common scenarios in this web tool, and it is a bit less transparent because it's a bit harder with the web tool to see those backend calculations. And so if those are things that you're really looking for from your analysis, then maybe the Excel tool would be a better fit. So we have a little demonstration here of the scope tool in action. So from the homepage at scopeitdp.org, feel free to start the video. You can click on that main button and begin your evaluation of a BRT project. So first, we're entering the information about the area where the project is located. So entering the country and city. Here we're just using a sample of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And then next, we're entering details about the route. And this is where we actually have geospatial features. You can draw the route of the future BRT right on this map. If you don't want to do that, there's also a few other options, as well as so you can enter manually the details about the route, or you can upload a geospatial file. But you can see in the current demonstration that you can also enter the locations of the stops if you have those available. And the tool will calculate local information based on the locations of those stops. Right, so continuing, now we'll enter a bit more information about the context of the project. And I want to pause here for a moment and highlight that the tool automatically calculates the average population density near the BRT stations, and as a result, the number of people impacted by the project. So a really helpful indicator. And continuing on, we'll also be able to enter more information about the fleet size, the speed of the future BRT, and that fleet size is the fleet that is active on the corridor. And here we have highlighted the peak frequency of the future BRT, so another really helpful KPI. And that as additionally here we have a section for some custom inputs. We've allowed users to enter the most commonly needed custom inputs, such as the citywide modal split of travel, and as well as the percentage of future riders who are shifting to BRT. So that's a section where if you have a survey of riders and what modes they would have used, you can actually enter that data. Okay, so here we are at the results page. So you can see the expected annual ridership. So that is the ridership in each of these future years. And we'll also be able to see the percentage of riders that are expected to shift from other modes. So most of these riders are expected to shift from the regular non-BRT bus, but we also have a good percentage that are shifting from private vehicles, and that's where we're going to see a lot of the emissions reductions in the next section. And I think we got a little bit ahead. No worries. Okay. Yeah, so the emissions reductions are also included in graphs and tables at the bottom. So we can see that the BRT is expected to save almost 8,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions each year, and that results in a cumulative close to 200,000 tons of GHG emissions saved. In this section, we're also seeing those air pollutant emissions reductions. And finally, there's the ability to download and save and share the results. Through these buttons at the bottom, you can share a link to the results, and you can also save a scenario to your account by making an account at scope.itdp.org. So that's a little demonstration of our web tool, and I'm really excited now to pass things over to the team from ITDP Mexico, Victor and Danielle, to talk about their use of the BRT scope tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. Okay. Hello, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Victor Medel, Public Transport and Electrification Leader for ITDP Mexico. Today, I'm going to present very briefly the case use and experience in Mexico using the BRT scope tool, especially the projects we help to assess in Mexico's ITDP office. Later on, Daniel Rodriguez, a Mobility Data and Statistics Coordinator in IMEPLAN, the Institute of Metropolitan Planning in Guadalajara, will tell us more about the practice and use of this tool in the city of Guadalajara. Just as context, we first used this BRT scope tool to help us calculate the avoided emissions in corridors that we support with this project. We have very different types of corridors, also in very different cities, as you can see on the map, across the country, and even with very different technologies. So we ask ourselves how much carbon dioxide equivalent is avoided for every project in this project called Net Zero Cities. As we can see, these are the four the examples of four corridors evaluated. As you can see, Even the type of systems change across all four corridors. And also these four examples highlighted in text and fields in yellow, it varies the information used and the options we also used for the demands prediction. And again, we also had the opportunity to try this tool on light train systems with some custom factors edited. So it was really important for us this, and was very useful because it generates a preliminary report of the impacts of these corridors, because it predicts some preliminary avoided emissions with little data. And that was very important for us because most of these corridors were under construction or even were just proposals. So that was very useful for this project. Another quick example where the BRT scope was used was the selection of the next line of the YETRAM in the city of Merida, which was the 6th line. The YETRAM is the first electric BRT light system in the southeast of Mexico. It operates 32 buses in 5 lines, and now the next step was to expand this system with a 6th line. And here we made a comparison between 3 corridors that the transport agency gave us as options. And our question here was which corridor was the best option to expand the system. So we with this, we have a lot of analysis, and we also used other tools like developed by ITDP, like the VRT standard. And at the end, the corridor selected was the corridor C, because it was more efficient, it had better performance, better design, lanes aligned to the center. And as you can see here, even though the corridor A had a corridor density and ridership larger, the trips avoided were similar in the corridor C, and also the emissions avoided were larger. So we had this information aligned to the other indicators that told us this is the corridor that needs to be implemented. So with all this in mind, we want to keep this aspect. We think the BRT scope is a powerful and useful tool because it's so flexible and it has a lot of applicability for every corridor. It's also easy to use, and you can work with it with minimal data. Also, it has several customized inputs, and that's why I want to pass on to my companion Daniel, that will tell us more about these tools, because they use this VRT scope tool with a lot more custom factors and a lot more information from their city.
Thank you, Victor. Well, here in IMEPLAN, we were working in the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. And while doing it, we saw that currently we have 112 kilometers of roads that were over capacity. And we wanted to know in the future how many would be the amount of those roads. And we saw that it will be a 31% of rise in those overcapacity roads. So we have 2 options: to maintain the current situation and or to reduce the overcapacity roads to 0. And to achieve that, we will have to get a 60% of decrease in the current modal split of private vehicles. So with that in mind, we develop a series of actions, measures, and strategies in the plan. Next slide, please. Yes, so in the sustainable plan, we develop 5 objectives for the mobility on our city, and also 18 goals, 8 strategic pillars, and 56 measures. And one of the strategic pillars was to decrease the number of motorized vehicles in our city. So we want to know what will be the impact of that measure in our city, and that's where we use the BRT scope tool of ITDP. Next slide, please. So this is one of the strategies that we proposed in the plan. It was to develop actions to prioritize the movement of collective public transport along strategic corridors. So the image that you can see is the metropolitan area of Guadalajara. In green is the existing BRT corridors. So we want to model what would be the impact of the new corridors in the modal shift in our city to see if we achieve that minus 60% in the private vehicle trips. So we use the tool to model 299 kilometers, and based on the ITDP's BRT standard, we could select if whether they will be bronze or silver or gold. And that was also a very important feature that we could set inputs that we already have based on our OD survey. So that was very useful. And another very useful thing was that we could see the predictions in several years. Our sustainable plan is projected to 2040 or goals. So the BRT tool could give us that information to that year. So with the implementation on this strategy, we saw that there will be an increase to 27.3 public transport modal share while implementing these corridors. So if we go to the next slide, this will be like in red, the actual situation for our city, and in blue, the future situation that we want to achieve. So the BRT scope tool help us to justify how the implementation of these corridors will help to decrease the private transport trips, but also how many of those trips will be coming from public transport or bicycle or another transport options. So with that in mind, this tool was very helpful for us to set these goals for the future, but also to convince the decision takers in our city how these corridors will help and impact the people in our city.
Thank you, Victor and Danielle. Next, we'll have Carlos from ITDP Indonesia share a little bit more about their usage of the scope models.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Carlos and I'm from ITDP Indonesia. I will explain the use of scope tools, especially for parking and bicycle infrastructure in the city of Jakarta. As everybody knows, Jakarta is one of the congested and most polluted city in the world, and it costs a lot for the local economy and the health aspect of people living in the city of Jakarta. So that's why the provincial government decided they need to implement not only pool policy by implementing BRT or MRT, but also implementing push policies such as electronic road pricing, low emission zone, or parking management. And in this case, I will explain to you more about the recommendation of parking management in Jakarta. The scope tools for parking management can be accessed in ITDP scope tools website, as Madeline said previously. This is the way of thinking to use the scope tools for parking management. The important data that we need to get is the area of residential office in the city, which we can convert it to the number of parking area as requested, but I will explain a bit more in the next slide. To give more context about the situation in Jakarta, this is one of the transit-oriented development area in Duku Atas. And this graph shows that the occupancy rate for off-street parking in TOD area are very low. And that's why we need to implement parking management strategy to reduce the minimum requirement for parking and push the city to convert the unused parking space into potential settlement for housing. This is the recommendation that we provided to the provincial government of Jakarta. We propose 3 zones of parking area. The red one will be mainly located near the mass public transportation and transit-oriented development. The yellow area will be larger at scale, and the green area will be located outside the center inner city area. And in this criteria and policy, you can see different strategy that we will implement for different zones of parking. And this is the result of scope tools for parking management. So this is the main minimum data requirement. So we can get the result of the accumulative reduction of carbon, NOx, and PM 2.5. We need the area for residential, commercial, and office. And fortunately, we can get it from the open source data provided from the government. And then we calculated the area using QGIS. And then we assume the reduction of minimum parking requirement for residential area, which will impact the Ficati reduction based from assumption that scope tools provided. Another interesting results that we can also get from scope tools is to get the potential housing unit from the reduction of minimum requirement of parking space for residential land uses. So previously, as I said, the residential area will have a minimum requirement for parking space, but scope tools also provided the assume or target. It will provide the new requirement for parking spaces that we will implement. So for example, previously for each 100-meter residential area, it must provide 1 parking area, but with the new regulation, half of it will be provided, and the scope tools can provide the number of housing unit that can be provided if we implement the parking management strategy. The next program that we will use is to implement or to calculate the GHG and air pollution reduction for cycling infrastructure. And we can also access the scope tools from the ITDP website. There are several data that we need to modify. For example, the number of people near bikeways, the existing modal share, which we get from the open public data provided from the government, or we can also conduct public surveys with a sample size according to the city size, and the result will be in range. So scope tools will provide a range of predicted GHG emission reductions from the bottom and upper range of it. This is the recommendation for cycling infrastructure in Jakarta until 2030. So when we're using the scope tools for cycling infrastructure, we estimate yearly the possible reduction of CO2, PM2.5, and NOx. This is the result for the scope tools for cycling infrastructure, and this is the main data that we need to get to achieve the result. So the most important thing is to get the data for population density, and then to have the existing bike lane shapefile or the future bike lane shapefile until the targeted year. And then we can compare it to the existing modal share. After we get this primary data, scope tools will give us a chance to predict the modal share for the expected to the targeted year. So for example, the percentage of people using bicycle in Jakarta is still 2%, but we expect maybe in 2030 it can improve 15%, and that improvement will be calculated into the potential results reduction of carbon, NOx, and PM2.5. And I think this is the last slide from me. We already provided this result to the local government of Jakarta, and they quite interesting with this result because they need a very quick methodology to assess the current basic infrastructure, and if they want to conduct a detailed calculation, they need to have a bigger budget to do it. But unfortunately, the city of Jakarta doesn't have that luxury. So using these tools will help them to estimate their reduction target in 2030. I think that's all from me. I will give it back to Madeline.
Well, thank you all so much for these incredible presentations. It's really amazing to hear how these tools have been used and made an impact around the world. And thank you all so much for sharing your fascinating questions. I'm going to start off with a couple of general kind of warm-up questions for our panelists, and then definitely want to get into some of these audience questions. So to start off, all of you have talked a bit about connecting the results of the scope tools to decision makers and to actual action on the ground. So I would love to get into more of these details. So how have you distributed and communicated the results? How exactly did you make that connection from the data to the decision makers? And what were some of the challenges of making that case? Maybe I'll start off with Carlos for that question, since I think you talked a little bit about it towards the end of your presentation.
Yeah, I think the challenge to communicate this result is to ensure that the government have the understanding of the end goal for these tools. And fortunately, the provincial government of Jakarta already established governor regulation to have reduction of PM 2.5. I think they need to reduce it 40% from the existing baseline in 2025. I think it's very important that the city officials put ambitious target first, and then we as ITDP can provide the necessary tools to help them achieve that goal and to monitor the result.
Thank you. Victor, Danielle, any thoughts?
Yeah, for us, it was important to communicate these results, but obviously very synthesized in a very clear way, where we will tell the decision makers this will be the positive impact in the congestion here in Guadalajara. Congested avenues with congested roads is like the main topic. So it's like if you tell the decision makers that by continuing with this trend of private transportation, they will have more congested roads. They will ask, well, what will be the solution? And if you talk about reducing the kilometers of over capacity or congested roads, and you tell them specifically where and in which amount of kilometers will be the reduction, is like the key point for them to pay.
In our case with those projects, what we found out is that the tool projected and backed up some other indicators that we were presenting. So there were any issues on that matter for the communication of these predicted avoided emissions. Yet there were preliminary. So we used all this information in the planning phases. So we use this information not as final result, right? So that was very important for us to communicate. So it's a topic that must be addressed from the beginning.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think this actually gets to some of our audience questions. So we had some questions about what phase to use the scope tools at, as well as can the tool use data from use existing data, as well as making future projections. So I think most of you have used the data to make those future projections, but have any of you used the tools or have experience with that kind of making impact predictions after the project has been implemented? And what were your experiences using the tools in these different ways? I might start with Danielle for this one, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
It's okay. Well, we haven't implemented the corridors yet because the plan just released last year, and it's a strategy for the next 15 years. But mentioning how we use the tool, something that you mentioned, Madeline, in your presentation was the backend calculations. For us, that was very important because we wanted to know where these calculations were coming from and to kind of test if they were where the data was coming from, and it was very useful to us to see the backend calculations in the Excel report and to know that all of that was like based on international and certified documents. So that was useful for us that if we could also check the population predictions index that the tool have and compare it to the ones that we have in our local uh, organizations. So we could like the tool has the flexibility to let us use another information, but do the calculations for us.
Yeah, that's really great to hear how the outputs that you needed really aligned with what the tool was able to provide. Victor, Carlos, have either of you been able to compare the predictions with real world results or use the tool to look at the impacts of an existing calculation?
In our case in Mexico, those examples we presented are not, we have not been able to make an assessment of the present. For example, the light train presented, it's also in Guadalajara, and will be finish the construction this year. So it will be very interesting to assess that with the new information and the actual operation. Also in Yetram, the VRT light system in Mérida, we are working very closely with the transport agency. So I'm sure it will be a very interesting project to assess these emissions or even the corridor ridership with the new information and with the actual passengers in those lines, in those systems. So sadly no, but I think it will be a very interesting exercise.
I think same with Victor, we haven't able to compare the model and the actual result, especially for air quality, since it's quite difficult to really narrow down the impact of transportation sector into the whole city area, especially in Jakarta, where the major contribution of air pollution is not only from transportation sector, but it also comes from industrial sector, which is difficult to really separate the result. But yeah, I think maybe in the future we can make it more specific.
Yeah, I think this speaks to a really important challenge and an opportunity. The challenge being that there's often this lag between the initial predictions and surveys to plan a project and then getting the actual results and continuing to monitor. So it's so important, I think, the aspect of collaboration and being able to get this data and share it and continuing to monitor these projects and then checking the how they compare to the initial predictions. And I hope some of the audience members, can also hear this and think about how we can all work to improve sharing data and our methods. And on that note, if you have any feedback on the scope tools or any data that you think could be helpful to contribute, that's always welcome. We're always working to improve these tools. So I'd love to ask you all another question. What do you think is an opportunity for the scope tools? How could we add on to the suite of tools? And do you see any opportunities for the web tools as well?
I'll start. For once, I think the tools can be integrated to get a more a clear picture of what's happening with the projects. Sometimes we have projects of BRT maybe that include the redesign of some cycling infrastructure and also a parking reform in the street. So using these tools to assess a better and a bigger picture of all the impacts that are presenting in a project that maybe has a lot of changes in a street, in a corridor, in the city, you know. So I think that's a big opportunity to use all the scope tools to generate more information and also more an accurate assessment of all the prevented impacts.
I think to add to Victor, scope tools is really useful for public communication because it is a rapid assessment, and I think public really interested with this kind of result. For example, when we publish the result of parking management, the public respond positively because in one of the transit-oriented development area, they can now realize in this building there is a vacant and unused parking space which can be converted into housing unit. So the government will be pushed more to convert that vacant parking lots into housing unit because the public now knows there's a potential in it.
Well, I will say, of course, the integration that Victor said, but I will say to share the know-how of this tool, like not only share the calculations or final results, but only being able to communicate how those calculations are made in order to that we all understand what are we seeing and how is the final corridor ridership calculated. I think that will be good as we want to know where data is coming and be sure what we are seeing is structure and well placed.
Thank you all. This was another interesting question from an audience member. What are the limits of this tool? When does it become proper to use a different or more involved tool or method? So yeah, could you all speak to what problems did using this tool solve for you, and what scenarios do you think would lead you to choose a different, maybe more complex or more involved type of tool?
Well, in our case in Guadalajara, we use a first steps model, like to see the the future in the situation in our city, but we weren't able to see these modal shift predictions. And that's the value that we found in the BRT scope tool. So I think we use different tools to get to our results, but different kind of tools get you different results. So for this model shift, that's why we rely on this BRT tool.
I think similar with Daniel, predicting model share is one of the biggest difficulties since we cannot really guarantee that it will happen. So in our case, when we use the cycling scope tools, we use best practice. For example, in a city that's similar to Jakarta, maybe a city in China, we took that example as a prediction that maybe in 5 years, the mode share for bicycle will increase 10% or more, but maybe it's not really reflecting the actual situation and the field. So I think that's one of the limitations for the scope tools.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to close it out with one final question. What advice would you share with transport planners or advocates in the audience who are interested in doing the kind of analysis that you all have done? I'll start with Carlos for this one.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting to predict the impact of our work since even government and public, they really want to know what is the benefit of using bicycle, what is the benefit of reducing parking spaces. And unfortunately, people cannot really see the direct impact of sustainable transportation. So that's why when we use these scope tools, we can create a vision in the future that in the next 10 years, this is the accumulative impact that the city will receive. And this impact will give a change of behavior that we are expecting.
I agree with Carlos. Also, I want to add that this tool, it's a very flexible one. You can, as we said, you can use very little data to have these predictions and these benefits of the, in this case, the BRT corridors. But also is very customizable. It has a lot and very complex custom factors that you can input in this very heavy tool, because sometimes it's difficult to get all the data that it's required with other tools, and this you can have the basic and the minimal data of the characteristics of your corridor or the length of your bicycle infrastructure. So with very little data, you can predict fairly the benefits of our work in the city. So it's really interesting to see also, as Daniel said previously, where the data is coming from. So I'll conclude that. Yeah.
And Danielle, would you like to close it off?
Yeah, and I will say to answer the what if questions that we do every day. If you're a curious person, since it is very simple to use and you do not need a lot of data, you can do it in a lot of situations. You just need, what happened if we put a corridor here, and also to compare it to another tools that you have. If you want to check, okay, how reliable is this tool? I'm going to compare it to this information that I have. You can do it and check, and also communicate to Madeline or the ITDP team. Hey, I see this area of opportunity. I'm sure they will hear what everybody has to say and improve this tool.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just to add on to that, we would love to hear from you about your use of the scope tools, about your interest in the scope tools. I'll just drop that link, scope.itdp.org, where you can find the web platform. And you can also reach out to us directly with any questions that you have. So I'll turn it over back to Alphonse to close us out.
Thank you, everyone. And again, just sharing a slide with the URL for the Scope web tool, and you can also visit our main website for more resources at itdp.org. And I know a lot of people were asking if we'll be sharing the presentations after, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email as we usually do for our webinars with links to more resources as well as these recordings. So thank you, everyone, for attending. It was a great discussion, and hope to see you again soon. Bye. Thank you.